Nintendo has made 2D games for a long time. A very long time. There hasn't been a time in Nintendo's history when they haven't made 2D games. Well, except maybe right now? You see, when Nintendo's consoles switched over to 3D with the N64, they stopped getting many 2D games, but Nintendo still made tons of them on their handheld systems. But now, with only one Nintendo system and no weaker handheld, we haven't gotten much of the way of 2D games. Sure, we've had a few ports, like Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze and New Super Mario Bros. U, and we've had the remake of Link's Awakening. There have also been smaller games like Yoshi and Kirby, which have been 2D, and Mario Maker 2, which is a little bit different, but still pretty much a 2D game. And I know that sounds like a decent amount, but really it's not as many as we've gotten in the past. And when you take out ports and remakes, it's only like 2 or 3 big 2D games. For the record, I'm not counting Super Smash Bros. Because that's different. We haven't gotten a new Donkey Kong, a new Super Mario Bros., a new 2D Zelda, or a new 2D Metroid. To be fair, right now there doesn't seem to be too much of a shortage, but over the next few years we'll see how committed Nintendo really is to continuing to make 2D games. Will Nintendo continue to make the variety of 2D series from their handhelds on the Switch? And if they are, should they? Hello all 2,160 of you, I'm Redkwan, and should Nintendo keep making 2D games? So your initial response might be that they definitely should. There are some great series from Nintendo's handhelds, and a lot of Nintendo's 2D games, like Mario and Zelda, feel like completely different series than their 3D versions. A lot of people legitimately like the 2D versions of some of these games more, and the fact that they're very different and there's a debate about which is better means that it should make a lot of sense to do them, especially when they take so little time to make relative to 3D games. These smaller 2D games are probably a lot less work to put together, especially when the old handheld teams are trained to work on stuff like this, and they've still been very successful and well received. There's still a market for games like this, and it seems like a no-brainer to keep pumping out some 2D games. But because I have no brain, I'm not really sure it is the right move. Sure, these games are cheap to make and they're still pretty successful and well received by fans, but are these games really the games people want to see right now? Sure, there are some people who are dying to get another 2D Metroid or 2D Zelda or Donkey Kong, but I think most people probably don't care all that much. What do most people really want? They want the next big 3D Zelda, the next big 3D Metroid, the big new 3D Mario. 2D games can still be fun, but the games that people are going to be excited to buy, that people are going to be talking about for years to come, and that people are going to be buying Switches to play aren't these 2D games. Zelda Breath of the Wild has sold like 15 million copies, and I think it's a pretty safe bet that Link's Awakening isn't coming anywhere close to that. Breath of the Wild sold millions of Switches, and Link's Awakening probably hardly made a dent. That's not to say that 2D games can't be helpful or serve a purpose, but they don't have anywhere close to the impact that 3D games do. Of course, none of this would matter if making 2D games wasn't taking anything away from the production of 3D games, but I don't think that's really true either. First of all, if there are some people working on 2D games, that means less people working on 3D games. I know that people from the old handheld teams are probably better suited to making those types of games, but I'm sure quite a few of them could be used on 3D games instead, and the rest could continue to work on the 2D projects that would still be available, because it's pretty unlikely that Nintendo wouldn't need people to make anything 2D anymore. There are some series that do just work better in 2D, like Kirby and Yoshi. But even if like half the people moved out, that's still a big boost to Nintendo's development resources, and that could mean a few more big 3D games. If Nintendo keeps putting time into a lot of smaller 2D projects, that's fewer people to work on the bigger stuff. I also think 2D games might be devaluing 3D games on the Switch, and maybe the Switch itself. Most of the 2D games the Switch has now are still $60, which is the same price as games like Breath of the Wild, Mario Odyssey, and Smash Ultimate. Yoshi's Crafted World, Kirby Star Allies, and New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe are all $60. I think if people see a Nintendo game that's $60, they'll assume that it's one of Nintendo's biggest and best games. Again, that's not to say these games are bad, but Nintendo probably doesn't want people thinking New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe and Kirby Star Allies are as good as it gets on the Switch. Maybe this isn't a problem that's going to cause any real damage, but the more people associate these smaller games with what the Switch is, if Nintendo's releasing them at full price, the less interesting and exciting the Switch is going to seem. And that could potentially cut into the Switch's sales a little bit. So should Nintendo keep making 2D games? Well, I think it's sort of a balancing act. I think it'd be a mistake for Nintendo to keep making as many 2D games as they have in the past, because they aren't as exciting when they're on a console as when they were on a handheld, they don't sell as well as the big games, and they don't sell consoles. But at the same time, I think it's a good idea to make some 2D games. There are some series like Yoshi and Kirby that probably work much better in 2D than they would in 3D, and there are other projects like remaking Link's Awakening, which hopefully don't take too much effort and probably still make Nintendo quite a bit of money. There's still definitely room for these smaller games to fill out the Switch's library, and they can still be decently successful, but I think Nintendo should definitely focus more on the bigger games, because those contribute not only more in terms of sales, but also more in terms of making the Switch and Nintendo seem like really cool or something. There's also just less of a need for 2D games on the Switch because of how jam-packed the eShop is with indie games. If people want to play smaller 2D games, they just have a lot more options now. Up to this point, I think Nintendo's been pretty smart about it. They've still filled that need of 2D games with a lot of their ports and remakes, with a Kirby and a Yoshi thrown in, but they focused most of their resources on the bigger, newer games. With a lot of those ports gone now, it'll be interesting to see if they make new 2D games in some of these series, or if they release quite a bit fewer 2D games than they have in, I don't know, forever. If I were Nintendo, 1, that would be not too cool because I would be a company and not alive, and 2, I would probably make less 2D games going forward. There's still some demand, and the occasional 2D game is still a good idea, but moving a lot of those resources over to 3D development and focusing more on the bigger, more impactful games is probably the way to go. Now that I say this, we're probably going to be flooded with 2D games, because that's how it seems to work. Well, I'm Redkwan. Do you think Nintendo should keep making a decent amount of 2D games, or do you think it'd be better for them to make fewer, to focus more on other things? What do you think it'd be like to be a company? I think it'd be pretty awful, because then you couldn't be alive. Also, the shareholders would stink, but mostly the not alive part. Anyways, I'm Redkwan, thank you all for watching, and I'll hopefully see you all later. Goodbye.
You might earn yourself a nifty reward.